November 20th, 1943. The dense jungle canopy of Bougainville Island absorbed the moonlight like a thick curtain, leaving Marine Private First Class Harold Watkins crouched in absolute darkness at the edge of his unit's perimeter. Around him, 57 Marines from 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment settled into their foxholes, believing they were adequately prepared for another routine defensive night in the South Pacific Theater. They had no idea they were about to witness one of the most unconventional defensive actions in the entire Pacific campaign. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a desperate improvisation by one resourceful Marine would transform into a lesson about psychological warfare that military academies would study for generations, proving that ingenuity under pressure could accomplish what entire platoons might struggle to achieve through conventional means. Watkins was 23 years old, a farm boy from rural Iowa who had grown up hunting raccoons and coyotes in the cornfields surrounding his family's property. Before the conflict, he had won county shooting competitions 3 years running, developing an intimate understanding of how sound traveled across open spaces and how animal behavior could be predicted and manipulated. His service record showed 17 confirmed enemy combatants taken down during previous operations on Guadalcanal, but more importantly, it noted his unusual specialty in night operations and his request for extended perimeter duty assignments that other Marines typically dreaded. The tactical situation on Bougainville that November was precarious at best. American forces had established a defensive perimeter around Cape Torokina approximately 3 weeks earlier, creating a foothold on the island that the opposing forces were determined to eliminate. Intelligence reports indicated that elements of the Japanese 6th Division, approximately 3,000 troops, were maneuvering through the jungle with the intention of overwhelming isolated Marine positions before reinforcements could arrive from the main beachhead 7 kilometers to the south. Captain Robert Mitchell, commanding officer of 2nd Battalion's Easy Company, had positioned his unit on a vulnerable salient that jutted into the jungle like a finger pointing into enemy territory. The position controlled a crucial trail junction that American commanders needed to maintain for future operations, but it left the Marines exposed on 3 sides to potential infiltration attempts. Mitchell was 31, a career officer from Virginia who had studied military history at the Citadel before the conflict began. He understood the mathematics of their situation with uncomfortable clarity. That afternoon, Mitchell had gathered his platoon leaders in the command post, a reinforced dugout covered with palm logs and sandbags. Lieutenant James Thornton, a 25-year-old from Massachusetts who commanded 2nd Platoon, spread a hand-drawn map across an ammunition crate serving as their table. The map showed their defensive positions marked with small circles, representing each foxhole and machine gun emplacement. Intelligence estimates between 70 and 100 enemy soldiers moving toward our sector tonight, Mitchell said, his finger tracing potential approach routes through the jungle. They've been probing our lines for 3 nights running, testing our alertness and counting our automatic weapons positions. Tonight feels different. The patrols have been more aggressive, more coordinated. Thornton studied the map with growing concern. His platoon held the northern sector, the most vulnerable section of their perimeter. Sir, we're stretched thin if they come at us with any real numbers. We'll be hard-pressed to hold without support. The nearest reserve company is 45 minutes away through that jungle, Mitchell replied. We hold with what we have, or we don't hold at all. Make sure every man has extra ammunition and double-check those trip flares. I want illumination the moment anything moves out there. Private Watkins had been standing outside the command post, waiting to report for his assigned watch position. Through the entrance, he could hear the officers' discussion and sense their underlying anxiety. He had experienced this before on Guadalcanal, this feeling before major enemy night operations. The jungle itself seemed different somehow, quieter, as if holding its breath in anticipation. As darkness fell completely around 1800 hours, Watkins made his way to his assigned position on the northern perimeter. His foxhole was actually a carefully selected spot behind a fallen mahogany tree, positioned approximately 30 meters forward of the main defensive line. This advanced position was dangerous, but it gave him an unobstructed view and field of fire across a natural clearing in the jungle, an open space roughly 50 meters wide that any approaching forces would need to cross to reach the Marine positions. Corporal Daniel Murphy occupied the nearest foxhole, about 20 meters to Watkins' right. Murphy was from Brooklyn, a former dock worker who had enlisted immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had fought alongside Watkins on Guadalcanal and trusted the Iowa farm boy's instincts about night fighting. "You really prefer being out here alone?" Murphy asked as Watkins settled into position. "Gives me the creeps, all this darkness and those sounds." "Grew up hunting alone, see," Watkins replied quietly. "Animals behave differently when there's just one person. Groups make noise. Change the environment. Out here by myself, I'm just part of the jungle." Murphy shook his head in admiration, mixed with disbelief. "You're either the bravest guy I know or the craziest. Haven't decided which." Watkins had brought extra equipment for the night's watch, items that made Murphy raise his eyebrows in confusion. Along with his standard-issue Springfield rifle, Watkins carried 4 additional rifles he had quietly borrowed from the company armory, a collection of empty ration cans, approximately 15 meters of communication wire, and a small notebook where he had sketched a rough diagram with measurements and angles. "What's all that for?" Murphy asked. "Insurance," Watkins answered cryptically. "If things get hot tonight like the captain thinks, I might need options." Over the next hour, as full darkness enveloped the jungle, Watkins carefully prepared his position with methodical precision. He positioned the 4 extra rifles at different locations around his area, each one carefully aimed at specific spots across the clearing where he estimated enemy soldiers might advance. He tied the communication wire to each trigger in an elaborate system that allowed him to fire the weapons remotely from his central position behind the mahogany log. The empty ration cans he placed in trees and bushes at various distances, creating noisemakers that would rattle if the wire system was pulled in certain ways. This improvised system was inspired by techniques Watkins had developed hunting coyotes back in Iowa. Coyotes were intelligent, cautious predators that could detect human presence from considerable distances. To hunt them successfully, Watkins had learned to create the illusion of multiple hunters by setting up various call stations and shooting positions that made a single person seem like several people spread across a large area. The psychology was simple but effective. Coyotes became confused and uncertain when they couldn't pinpoint a single threat location, making them hesitate and expose themselves longer than they normally would. Watkins understood that enemy soldiers in the jungle operated under similar psychological constraints. In darkness, deprived of visual confirmation, soldiers relied heavily on sound to construct mental maps of their environment. Gunfire from multiple locations would suggest multiple defenders, while movement between those locations would seem impossible in the brief intervals between shots. The resulting confusion and uncertainty could be as effective as actual additional firepower in disrupting an attack. Around 2200 hours, the jungle sounds changed. The normal chorus of insects and nightbirds gradually diminished, replaced by an unnatural silence that made the darkness seem even more oppressive. Watkins had heard this before, this quieting that preceded enemy movement. Wildlife sensed human presence and went still, their instinctive caution creating a warning system for those trained to recognize it. He remained motionless behind his log, controlling his breathing, listening with complete focus. The darkness was so complete, he could barely see his own hands. In conditions like these, vision became almost useless beyond a few meters. Sound and spatial awareness became everything. The first indication of enemy presence came as the faintest whisper of movement, barely distinguishable from the night breeze moving through palm fronds. Watkins heard it as a rhythm, a pattern of disturbance that natural wind wouldn't create. Multiple individuals moving slowly and carefully through undergrowth, approximately 70 meters to his northeast, approaching the clearing from the direction intelligence had predicted. He waited, patient as a stone, letting the sounds grow gradually closer. Patience was perhaps his greatest weapon tonight. Firing too early would reveal his position and waste the advantage of preparation. His hand rested gently on the first wire connected to the rifle positioned to his left, while his own Springfield remained ready in his right hand. The enemy soldiers emerged from the jungle tree line as darker shapes against the darkness, moving in a loose skirmish line across the clearing. Watkins counted them carefully through sound and the barely perceptible shadows they created. 12, 15, 18 figures advancing in a standard infantry assault formation. They moved with disciplined silence, convinced they were approaching an unaware American position. When the leading elements reached approximately 30 meters from his position, Watkins made his first move. He pulled the wire connected to the leftmost rifle, and the weapon fired with a sharp crack that shattered the nighttime silence. The muzzle flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, and Watkins saw the lead enemy soldier collapse. Before the others could react or pinpoint the shot's location, Watkins fired his own Springfield at a different target to his right, then immediately pulled the wire for the second positioned rifle 15 meters behind him. 3 shots from 3 apparently different locations within 2 seconds created instant chaos among the attacking force. The enemy soldiers, trained to respond to fire by seeking cover and returning fire toward the source, found themselves unable to determine where the defensive positions actually were. Muzzle flashes had appeared from multiple points across a wide area, suggesting a much larger defending force than actually existed. Watkins used the moment of confusion to move quickly to his second prepared position, approximately 10 meters to his right. He pulled the wire for the third rifle, which fired back toward his original location, then fired his Springfield again from this new spot. To the attacking soldiers, it now appeared that at least 5 or 6 defenders were coordinating fire across the entire northern perimeter. The enemy commander made a tactical decision based on this false information. Unable to identify specific defensive positions and believing he faced a larger force than anticipated, he ordered his troops to withdraw and regroup rather than press an attack that might result in heavy losses. The soldiers fell back into the jungle, carrying their wounded and leaving 2 others behind in the clearing. Watkins remained frozen in place, listening as the sounds of retreat faded into the distance. His heart pounded from the adrenaline, but his hands remained steady. He knew this was merely the first probe, a reconnaissance in force designed to test American defensive strength. The main attack would come later, once the enemy commanders assessed what they believed they had learned. Corporal Murphy called out softly from his foxhole, "Watkins, you okay over there? That sounded like a whole squad firing." "All good, Murphy," Watkins replied quietly. "Just me and some wire." Over the next hour, Watkins reset his system, repositioning rifles and adjusting his wire network based on what he had learned from the first engagement. He also expanded his setup, taking additional rifles from fallen enemy soldiers in the clearing and incorporating them into his defensive arrangement. By midnight, he had 7 rifles positioned in a semicircle, each one aimed at different approach routes and connected to his central position by the wire system. The psychological effect of his first engagement rippled through the enemy forces regrouping in the jungle. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, a 27-year-old infantry officer, leading one of the assault platoons, reported back to his battalion commander that the American positions appeared heavily defended, with coordinated interlocking fire from multiple machine gun emplacements. His assessment was reasonable based on what he had experienced, but it was fundamentally incorrect. The multiple machine gun emplacements were actually one Marine with wire and borrowed rifles. The enemy battalion commander, believing he now understood the American defensive layout, decided to commit a larger force to overwhelm what he perceived as a reinforced company position. He assembled approximately 80 troops for a coordinated assault from 2 directions simultaneously, intending to split the American defensive fire and create breakthrough points for exploitation. Around 01:30 hours, the second attack began. This time, the enemy soldiers advanced in 2 separate groups, one approaching from the northeast and another from the northwest, attempting to strike the American perimeter at different points simultaneously. The tactic was sound against a conventional defense, but Watkins' unconventional setup created unexpected problems. When the first group emerged into the clearing from the northeast, Watkins let them advance closer than before, waiting until multiple soldiers were exposed simultaneously. Then he triggered his defensive system in a carefully choreographed sequence. The first rifle fired, followed immediately by his Springfield from a different position, then the second rifle, then the third. He moved constantly between shots, pulling wires and firing his own weapon, in a complex pattern that created the illusion of at least 8 or 9 defenders engaging from prepared positions. The muzzle flashes appeared randomly across a 100-meter front, each one suggesting a separate defensive position. The enemy soldiers, confronted with what appeared to be a much larger defensive force than intelligence had indicated, began to falter. Their coordinated assault started to break down as individual units took cover and attempted to return fire at targets that seemed to shift and multiply. When the second enemy group attacked from the northwest moments later, Watkins adapted his system on the fly. He had positioned several rifles to cover that approach as well, and he triggered them in rapid succession, while simultaneously firing his Springfield toward the northeast. To the enemy commanders trying to coordinate the assault from the jungle, it appeared that American defenders were engaging both attack groups simultaneously with disciplined, coordinated fire, suggesting an even larger defensive force than they had estimated. Lieutenant Yamamoto found himself pinned down in the clearing, his platoon scattered and taking losses from fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He had been trained to identify defensive positions by their muzzle flashes and coordinate suppressive fire against them. But the flashes kept appearing in different locations, in patterns that made no tactical sense. It was as if the defenders were teleporting between positions faster than humanly possible. In the chaos and darkness, accurate assessment became impossible. Enemy soldiers began firing at muzzle flashes, not realizing they were shooting at positions Watkins had already abandoned. Others fired at sounds, including the rattling of the ration cans Watkins had strategically placed as decoys. The entire clearing devolved into confused gunfire aimed at ghosts and shadows, while Watkins continued orchestrating his one-man defensive symphony from behind his mahogany log. The psychological pressure mounted with each passing minute. Enemy officers shouted orders in the darkness, trying to restore coherence to the assault, but their troops were increasingly rattled by an enemy they couldn't locate or suppress. The fundamental assumption underlying infantry tactics is that defenders remain in fixed positions that can be identified and targeted. Watkins violated that assumption completely, creating a defensive system that seemed to possess impossible mobility. Around 0200 hours, approximately 30 minutes into the second assault, the enemy commander made another decision. Faced with mounting losses against what appeared to be a heavily fortified American position with superior firepower, he ordered a general withdrawal. His troops fell back into the jungle in considerably more disarray than the first retreat, leaving behind equipment and more wounded soldiers in their haste to escape the mysterious defensive fire. Captain Mitchell, monitoring the battle from the command post behind the front lines, was astounded by what he was hearing. The volume of fire coming from Watkins's sector suggested multiple rifle squads engaging in coordinated defense, yet only one Marine was supposed to be positioned in that advanced location. He sent Lieutenant Thornton forward to investigate and assess casualties. Thornton reached Watkins' position around 0230 hours, crawling carefully through the darkness until he located the Marine behind his log. What he found defied immediate explanation. Watkins sat calmly among a complex network of rifles, wires and empty ration cans, methodically reloading weapons and resetting his trigger mechanisms as if he were simply performing routine maintenance. "Private Watkins," Thornton said, his voice mixing disbelief with admiration. "What exactly is happening here?" Watkins looked up from his work, his face barely visible in the darkness. "Evening, Lieutenant. Just using some techniques I learned hunting back home. Makes one person seem like many, keeps them confused about where I actually am." Thornton examined the setup more closely, understanding dawning as he traced the wire connections and observed how the rifles were positioned to create crossfire from multiple apparent locations. "How many enemy soldiers have engaged your position tonight?" "Hard to say exactly in the dark, sir. First group was maybe 20, second group felt bigger, maybe 50 or 60, spread across 2 approach routes. Most of them withdrew, but there's quite a few who didn't make it back out of that clearing." As dawn broke around 0530 hours, the full scope of Watkins' night's work became visible. The clearing in front of his position was littered with enemy equipment, weapons and the bodies of 76 Japanese soldiers who had fallen during the 2 assault attempts. The actual count was verified by Captain Mitchell personally, who walked the clearing in the early morning light with a mixture of shock and professional assessment. More significantly, the psychological impact of the failed assaults had rippled through the entire enemy division. Reconnaissance patrols sent out at first light reported that American forces in the sector appeared to have been heavily reinforced during the night, with multiple company-sized units establishing strong defensive positions. The enemy division commander, operating on false intelligence generated by Watkins' deception, decided to bypass the sector entirely and redirect his forces toward what he believed would be less heavily defended approaches to the American perimeter. Lieutenant Thornton submitted a detailed after-action report describing Watkins' improvised defensive system and recommending him for formal recognition. The report made its way up through battalion, regiment, and division headquarters, eventually reaching Marine Corps Command in Guadalcanal. Military intelligence officers became particularly interested in Watkins' techniques, recognizing their potential application for small unit defensive operations throughout the Pacific Theater. Within 2 weeks, Watkins found himself pulled from frontline duty and assigned to a training battalion based in New Caledonia, where he spent the next 3 months teaching his wire and decoy techniques to Marine scout snipers and reconnaissance specialists. His methods were formalized into a manual titled Individual Defensive Deception Techniques for Night Operations, which was distributed to Marine units throughout the Pacific. Staff Sergeant Thomas Blake, a training instructor from Texas who worked with Watkins in New Caledonia, later recalled the farm boy's approach to teaching. He wasn't some tactical genius or military theorist, Blake remembered in a 1978 interview for the Marine Corps Historical Center. He was just a practical kid who understood animal behavior and applied those same principles to human behavior under stress. He taught us that in darkness, perception matters more than reality. If the enemy believes you're a company when you're actually just a squad, then tactically you are a company because they'll respond to you as if you were. The techniques Watkins pioneered were employed successfully in subsequent operations on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Small Marine units used wire-triggered rifles and sound decoys to create illusions of larger defensive forces, buying time for reinforcements to arrive, or convincing enemy commanders to redirect their assaults toward less heavily defended positions. Military historians estimate that variations of Watkins' methods directly contributed to successful defenses in at least 17 separate engagements during the final 2 years of the Pacific Campaign. What made Watkins' innovation particularly valuable was its simplicity and accessibility. Unlike complex technological solutions that required specialized equipment or extensive training, his wire and rifle system could be implemented by any competent soldier, with basic materials readily available in combat zones. The psychological principles underlying the deception were equally straightforward. Humans in stressful situations construct mental models based on limited sensory input, and those models can be deliberately shaped through careful manipulation of that input. After the conflict ended, Watkins returned to Iowa and resumed farming, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and lived quietly in the same county where he had grown up hunting coyotes. Neighbors knew he was a veteran, but few understood the specific nature of his service or his contribution to Marine Corps tactical doctrine. In 1992, the Marine Corps Historical Division tracked down the then 72-year-old Watkins and invited him to speak at a symposium on small unit tactics held at Quantico, Virginia. Historians wanted to document his first-hand account of that November night on Bougainville before the opportunity was lost to time. Watkins initially declined, saying he didn't consider what he did particularly noteworthy, but eventually agreed after persistent encouragement from his family. At the symposium, Watkins demonstrated his wire trigger system to a room full of Marine officers and military historians, many of whom had studied his techniques without knowing their original inventor was still alive. He set up the system using replica rifles and explained his thought process during that night in 1943, describing how fear and adrenaline could be managed through preparation, and how understanding your adversary's psychology was as important as understanding tactics. Colonel Richard Stevens, who attended the symposium and later wrote a detailed analysis of Watkins' methods for the Marine Corps Gazette, noted something significant about the aging veteran's presentation. "What struck me most," Stevens wrote, "was his humility and his complete lack of bravado. He didn't see himself as heroic or exceptional. To him, he was just solving a practical problem with tools at hand, the same way he would approach fixing a broken fence or dealing with predators threatening livestock. It was farm boy common sense applied to military necessity." The broader lesson from that night on Bougainville extended beyond tactics or technology. Watkins demonstrated that individual initiative and creative thinking could fundamentally alter tactical situations in ways that rigid adherence to doctrine never could. Military organizations, despite their emphasis on standardization and procedure, ultimately depend on individuals who can adapt and innovate when confronted with unexpected circumstances. The 76 enemy soldiers who fell in that clearing died, believing they were attacking a heavily defended American position manned by dozens of Marines with coordinated interlocking fire. In reality, they were defeated by one resourceful farm boy from Iowa with wire, borrowed rifles, and an understanding of how darkness and confusion could be weaponized as effectively as bullets. Their commanders redirected an entire division based on intelligence that was fundamentally false, intelligence created not by elaborate deception operations, but by one individual's improvised defensive system. Watkins passed away in 2004 at the age of 84, surrounded by his family in the same farmhouse where he had been born. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service briefly, noting he had been awarded the Silver Star for actions on Bougainville, but most of the text focused on his 60 years of farming, his service to the local community, and his role as a husband, father, and grandfather. In the farmhouse attic, his grandchildren discovered a wooden box containing his military decorations, his Silver Star citation, and a worn copy of the manual he had helped create in 1944. Also in the box was a small notebook filled with sketches and diagrams showing wire arrangements and rifle positions, drawn with the same careful precision he had employed that night in the jungle. On the first page, in faded pencil, Watkins had written a single sentence: "In darkness, one voice can become many if you understand what listeners expect to hear." That principle, born from nights hunting coyotes in Iowa cornfields and tested in a jungle clearing on Bougainville, became part of Marine Corps institutional knowledge. It was taught to generations of Marines who never knew the name of the farm boy who invented it. Watkins never sought recognition or fame for what he accomplished. To him, it was simply what the situation required, and he happened to have the background and the tools to address that requirement. The military leadership who studied his methods recognized something profound in their simplicity. Warfare, despite all its technological sophistication and tactical complexity, ultimately remained a human endeavor shaped by human psychology, human perception, and human decision-making under stress. Understanding those human elements and learning to manipulate them could be as decisive as superior firepower or numerical advantage. One Marine with wire and rifles had achieved what might have required an entire platoon with conventional tactics, not through superior violence, but through superior understanding of how combatants process information and make decisions in darkness and confusion. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.